Oh, okay.
Dr. Ashwin Mahalikam, professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at IIT Madras, is an expert in infrastructure project management, public-private partnerships, and technology-led infrastructure development. An alumnus of IIT Madras and Stanford University, Dr. Ashwin has extensive academic, research, and entrepreneurial experience. Dr. Ashwin is also the co-founder of Okapi Advisory Services and has contributed to several national committees and professional forums.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you very much. I'd first like to thank both CPCL and MMA for inviting me here for a variety of reasons, but also because they use this very nice photo of mine, which still makes me look like I'm 30. So, but it's always a pleasure coming here for two reasons. One, whenever I come here, the room is full. So CPCL and MMA have this ability to draw people in. But also, we always seem to talk about a topic that is not on the beaten path. Right? I think this is a fascinating topic to look at, the legacy that the public sector leaves, and we've never really talked about it. So I really want to thank and congratulate the organizers for coming up with these thought-provoking ideas that we want to discuss. Normally, it is not a good idea to speak after Professor Anantha Nageshwaran, because he makes such eloquent points that what comes after is likely to be a letdown. But in this particular case, I'm actually quite happy that I'm speaking after him, because I think he made some very, very relevant points that I want to piggyback on. And I think one of the critical points that I took away from what he said is this notion of decision-making timelines, right? So the private sector is very often caught in this quarter-to-quarter mentality, and therefore you've got to show relatively immediate results to your shareholders, stakeholders. The government has slightly longer timelines, perhaps 5 years or so, assuming it's a stable government. If it's not, then even lesser. But then again, you want to sort of hurry your decision so you see results in that time frame. Whereas both the academia and the public sector can actually afford longer timelines. And in a minute, I'll tell you why I think longer timelines are very critical to us achieving supremacy and sovereignty and and things like this. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how academia and the public sector can work together to achieve this goal of an Atmanirbhar Bharat or a Vikasit Bharat, primarily because of this ability to think along these same time horizons. So to start with, I have only one simple thesis, right, that underpins my talk, which is that if India needs to be a developed country, if we need to achieve Atmanirbharta and all of these kinds of things, we need technological supremacy. I think there is absolutely no two ways about it. Now, when I say, and of course, I'm a professor from IIT Madras, so you would expect me to say that, right? So, but it is true, and it's something that I believe. Now, when I say technological supremacy, there are many ways in which people can think about it. Certainly, I think it's very important for us to be operationally efficient. We need to sort of deliver whatever we deliver to the highest standards of quality and so on. But I think we also need to control technology. I think we need to have an insight on where technology is going next. And that, I think, is going to be the game changer. Today, I would argue that as a nation, we are not in control of our technological destiny, right? I'll just give you some examples. People today cannot stop talking about AI. Okay, it is the next big thing. It is the first word out of everyone's mouth, and it gets worse. If you go to Silicon Valley, and if every alternate word out of your mouth is not AI, then your existence is deemed worthless, right? So today, everything is about AI. Now, when you think about AI and you think about what are some of the, what firms come to your mind when you think about AI? Anthropic. Okay, I'm glad people said that first. I'm a big fan of Anthropic. What else? Well, Claude is Anthropic's model, but OpenAI is another one. Then Google, Microsoft with Gemini and Copilot and all of these, right? So today, when you look at the AI debate is actually being controlled by organizations that are not in India, as a result of which we are having to play a little bit of catch up. Many of us use these models, but then, of course, we're always worried that somebody might turn off the tap. So there is, of course, this endeavor to bring sovereignty into AI. And recently, we do have our own sovereign model, which I think is called Vikram, if I remember correctly. I think it starts with a V. But we are playing catch up in that sort of domain. And that is therefore restricting our ability to provide cutting-edge solutions that are at the edge of AI, although we have several, I think, very relevant challenges that we need to solve in India. If you go one step further and you say, what is the challenge? Why aren't we able to build these models? One of the simple reasons that comes out is that to build artificial intelligence models, you need computational capacity, right? You need these GPUs as people call them. Elon Musk in one cluster has more GPUs than all of India put together, right? So again, we are constrained by the fact that we don't have enough computational capacity to be able to develop these kinds of models. And that again is a function of not necessarily being a leader in not the AI race this time, but in the semiconductor race, right? Where again, the major semiconductor companies happen to be either in the United States or in the Netherlands or in Taiwan and some of these kinds of geographies. So the fact that we are not at the cutting edge, right, has in turn led to a situation where we are playing catch up, and therefore we are sort of at the mercy of other organizations, which is a position that we don't want to be in. So the question then is, how do we sort of invert this? Okay. And to me, when you look at these kinds of cutting edge technologies, they are at step 3 of a 3-stage process. Step one is basic scientific research, right? Step 2 is taking that scientific research and making it more applied. And step 3 is taking applied research and making it what we call translational, which means people in industry, the common man can actually benefit from these technologies, right? So this is sort of the value chain. You look at AI, it's the same story. It's rooted in a set of mathematics, which came out of essentially university ecosystems. That mathematics was the basic research that led to applications that now has led to translation into these kinds of models that all of us use. So when you look at this value chain, you have academic institutions on the one hand that are supposed to do this kind of basic work, and then a whole variety of public and private sector organizations that can then help translate this. And I think one of the challenges we've had in India is that this entire value chain has been a little bit broken. We've not been doing that kind of cutting edge scientific work in our universities, as a result of which we've not been able to necessarily move across the value chain. And again, if you look back and say, and I just said this, when you look at the United States, which is clearly, superpower in this area, you'll find that if you go back 40, 50, 60 years ago, a lot of what we're talking about was research that was happening at a Stanford, at an MIT, and these kinds of places in departments of mathematics or in electrical engineering. And over a period of time, 40, 50 years later, you have these kinds of organizations coming up. Go even further, you go back to maybe about 100 years ago, where one might argue that several Western European countries were superpowers at the time. Again, it was built on fantastic institutions that were doing fundamental work on nuclear physics or whatever it was in Copenhagen, in Groningen, in places in Germany and things like that, right? So, and if you go even further back and you think of a time where India was potentially a world leader, right, several hundred years ago, you will find that that coincided at the time where we had universities like Nalanda and Takshila, where back in the day, knowledge was emanating, right? I mean, there are several areas in science, in mathematics, in medicine, in philosophy that essentially originated out of India and went all over the world. The number system is one of the, I think, the most important but least talked about innovations that came out of India. And again, at a point where everyone was looking towards India, saying what technology is coming out. So I think we have to somehow go back and recapture this, right? We again need our universities to be the Nalandas and Takshilas of that age, start doing this sort of wonderful work. And then we need organizations that take that work and translate it into practice. Then we start leading the world in technology, okay? So now I guess the question I want to come to is, A, what is preventing us from doing this? And B, what is the role that the public sector has played and can play in this transformation? And to sort of just explain this, I'll take the simple example of IIT Madras. So we don't talk in the abstract, right? We actually talk in terms of an actual case study. And of course, a case study I know well because I've been teaching there for 2 decades. I was a student there as well. Right? Does anyone know when IIT Madras was started? 1959, exactly, right? So IIT Madras was started in 1959. When IIT Madras started, it was started completely with support from the government of India. So the government of India would give a grant, and that grant would be used to run the university's activities. All right. And if you look at the activities that the university really ran in its first few decades of existence, a lot of it was related to teaching, primarily undergraduate teaching. Right. So essentially, we had a bunch of smart students, and we would teach them, and those students would then go. Many of them, of course, went abroad. Some of them stayed back and used what we taught. But there was very little R&D that was really coming out of what we call IIT Madras version 1.0. All right. Maybe about 25, 30 years ago, I think all around, there was a recognition that universities could be places where R&D could happen, right? And that was a recognition that was felt by the universities themselves, saying, look, if we need to be relevant in this era, we need to do R&D. It was a point of view that the government had, saying our universities need to fuel this R&D boom. It was also a view that the public and private sector had, saying there are certain problems that we may be unable to solve, that with the help of academic institutions, we could potentially solve. So that led to what I would call version 2.0 of not only IIT Madras, but several universities, where we started doing a little bit of research. And in this process, the private sector's role and the public sector's role, more importantly, was very critical. So in a lot of cases, and this is true of CPCL, this is true of IOCL, of many of these organizations who came to an IIT Madras and said, I am having issues with, for instance, my reverse osmosis treatment process. Is there something we can do with regards to filtration techniques and things like this? What this started fueling was a way in which people started thinking about research, thinking about innovation. Up until that point, it was really, let me come into the classroom, please teach me, I will absorb that and I will go out. Now it sort of became a philosophy of, let me come in, let me listen to your problems, let me try to see if I can apply my mind and try to see if I can come up with solutions. So this is phase one of innovation. And there were quite a few, not only were there quite a few problems that were solved, but more importantly, this catalyzed the development of intellectual capability to innovate, right? And I think that is very, very important. We always complain that in many ways, the Indian education system stifles innovation because a lot of it tends to be rote memorization, right? How do you get out of that trap? You get out of that trap by giving people a problem that they cannot memorize, right? That no one has solved and saying, solve it, right? And over a period of time, that capacity develops. So in version 2.0, the public sector in many ways played a very important role in catalyzing this capacity. But the public sector was not alone here. Government was also doing this. We had the Department of Science and Technology and others. The private sector was also doing this. They had similar problems. And while we improved our capability and there was more research coming out, we are still very far away from getting to that world-leading position. Which brings me to where I think we need to go next, which is version 3.0. And version 3.0 is actually being the people who now invent the next generation of semiconductors or AI models and things like that. What is preventing us from doing it? I think there are three factors that are necessary. One is, do we have the right kind of potential among students entering these kinds of institutions to do this kind of work? There, I think the answer is hands down, yes. Right? You just look at the kids coming out today, coming in, forget the IITs, go down to tier 3, tier 4 universities. The people coming in are fantastically sharp. I think they're just more exposed. By and large, I think they have access to more information. The capability of people to do research is never in doubt. And that has never been in doubt in the past as well, because, the joke is that if you go to an Intel or any of these OpenAI or Anthropics or whatever, who do you see sitting there, right? You see people from India sitting there, right? It's not that somehow when they cross the ocean, their sort of neurons started flaring up. It's the same capability. So the capability exists in terms of the people who can actually do the research. Do we have people who can guide that research, right? Do we have people who can set that vision? And again, I would argue that the answer is yes. I think we have many visionary thinkers, both within academia as well as in the public sector and elsewhere, that can set these kinds of agendas. right? So human resources is not the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is really resources, right? We don't quite have the kinds of resources to do the kind of work that we aspire to do. So at IIT Madras, we had somebody who published this really wonderful paper in the #2 journal in the field. And we went and said, what would it take for you to publish in the #1 journal? Right? And they said, it's simple. We know exactly what we need to do. But I have a microscope, and this is something to do with protein structures and things like that. I have a microscope that can measure things at some nanometer, level resolution. But those guys sitting at MIT and Harvard and Princeton have a microscope that can measure at angstrom level resolution. So therefore, naturally, they're able to say more interesting things about that protein than I am, not because they're any smarter, but they have a device that can give them that resolution. If you give me that same device, right, I could do the same kind of work. So this is a repeated story that we now need to really augment our R&D capabilities by resourcing them. We need to look at cutting edge equipment and all of these other appurtenances that come with this. This is where I think in recent times, the public sector is playing a fantastic sort of role. So just to continue on this example, one of these microscopes is something called a cryo-electron microscope, a cryo-EM. For the first time in India, at IIT Madras, we now have one of these microscopic laboratories sponsored by a public sector organization, right? In this case, through CSR funding and things like this. Why would this organization choose to do this? It goes back again to the time horizons that we're talking about. Is this device going to achieve a technological breakthrough in 3 months? Absolutely not. Is it likely to achieve a technological breakthrough in 5 to 10 to maybe 15 years? Very possibly. And you need somebody with that kind of long-term vision to now invest in these kinds of resources that will then allow India to do a brand of research that it has not done before. And that brand of research is what will now create technologies of the future where we are no longer dependent on someone else, but others are dependent on us, right? And, I was just doing the calculations before I came here. But again, just to take the IIT Madras example, the public sector in the last few years has invested something like 150 crores in IIT Madras, a bunch of companies, including CPCL and IOCL. In fact, with CPCL, we've done some phenomenally interesting projects, including sanitation projects in Nagapattinam, but also other projects related to assistive devices and medical technology and things like this. And also with IOCL in the area of water and health, we've done but these are not just projects. These are not solving problems. These are setting up resources that will allow us to develop the technologies of the future, right? This is something that the private sector will find very, very difficult to do because the time horizons are long. This is something that government might also find difficult to do because their resources are constrained and there are several other opportunities. We all know that the proportion of R&D investment in India is one of the lowest compared to GDP, right? This is something that the public sector is uniquely positioned to do. And it is something that the public sector very quietly, very unnoticeably has been doing for a long period of time, to the point where you can go to a number of these academic institutions. You find now a series of laboratories, assets, resources that did not exist before. This is now starting to attract a breed of people that we did not have before, who are saying it is now worthwhile coming to India to pursue my research career. There are now people saying, I want to sort of pursue research as a career. And I'm very confident that in the next 10 to 15 years, there's the Science Museum in Calcutta. If anyone goes to that Science Museum in Calcutta, they have an exhibit on Nobel prizes and Nobel laureates. And there's a statistic that says that it takes about 14.1 years from the time of the discovery for a Nobel Prize to be awarded for that discovery on average. All right. Which means if we are looking at a Nobel Prize in India and if people say, will we get a Nobel Prize next year? Then you should look back 14 years or 13.1 years and say, did we do anything cutting edge 13.1 years ago? And the answer is probably not. But today we are actually doing this kind of work, fueled by the fact that the public sector and academia now have that match in terms of time horizons, which I'm very sure, we're talking about 2026 today, that by 2040 or by 2047, which is a nice milestone for all of us to look at, we are definitely going to have several Nobel-worthy ideas that come out of India. Those are going to essentially be the ones that help drive us to be leaders as far as global technology development and the economy are concerned. And that is, in my view, going to be fueled by academia on the one hand, working hand in hand with the public sector. So I just want to conclude by saying, in my view, I think the case for public sector, or the evidence that the public sector has been able to support India's growth towards sovereignty is very strong. And but it is also important to realize that we have to maintain this momentum over the next 10, 15 years to get to a point where we can look back and say the decisions that we made then have now brought us to where we are here, right? So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your patience. Uh, Unfortunately, as Professor Anantha Nageshwaran said, we have a visitor that we're hosting, so I'm also going to have to run without being able to stay for the Q&A. But I will be back at MMA very soon, I'm sure, and happy to take as many questions then as possible. And if there are pressing questions, people are very welcome to write to me, and I can see if I can answer them. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Mahalingam, for that insightful